The second lecture Mr. Jerry arranged was at Graduate Medical College, where about 25 physicians examined two biofeedback machines that we had brought along to be exhibited. They were the machines that had originally been constructed for Swami Rama to take to India at the end of 1970. One was an alpha theta brainwave feedback device, the other a combination machine in which one could choose the feedback of either respiration pattern, temperature, or heart rate. Built in the machine was a little analog computer that converted the raw EKG signal into a fluctuating voltage calibrated in beats per minute. In lectures to medical groups, there were always some in audience who were hopeful about the possibility of studying and teaching physiological self-regulation, but who had kept quiet about their interest because there was a danger of losing status or not being promoted. Western medicine has swept India to the extent that many Indian doctors are more Western than Westerners themselves, and short shrift is made of any discussion of the regulation of the autonomic nervous system. In fact, some doctors seemed embarrassed by yoga, as if they would like to erase it from their culture. They apparently thought of it as superstition from bygone days. Even when people of this opinion, however, the slides and films seemed persuasive, and implications of biofeedback training were not treated as inconsequential. The press conference that Swami had arranged in Delhi that day we landed had made headlines in many large newspapers in India. Wherever we went, therefore, we expected and medical people requested lectures. By the time we returned to Delhi at the end of our 90-day sojourn, we had lectured for about 750 medical people and 400 engineers and scientists. 3 of 6 subjects obtained at the Chandigarh Yoga Health Training Center were meditators. That is, they were concerned with states of consciousness without necessarily including the attainment of physiological controls of any kind. In this kind of meditation in particular, breathing exercises are sometimes used, not for the purposes of generating or demonstrating unusual control of body functions, but for the purpose of energizing the central nervous system through absorption of pranas that Swami Rama had discussed. The meditating subjects included Prapal Singh, an older man who had practiced for many years, Sheila Duga, a young woman who had meditated for only 3 months. She came from her job in one of the government offices to accommodate us. And a Mr. Chaudhuri, whose participation as a subject was arranged by his wife. Later, the Chaudhuris took us to their home for an Indian tea that must have taken from early morning to prepare. There we learned that Miss Chaudhuri was a teacher of transcendental meditation. Another Chandigarh subject was Mr. R.C. Gupta of Simla, who we had first met at the conference in Kanpur. Mr. Gupta was a long-time yogi, following the discipline of Swami Yogananda, whose book, The Autobiography of a Yogi, has become a bestseller in the United States. Mr. Gupta demonstrated Below's breathing, pranayama, control of breath, and Kriya Yoga, which involves a visualization of pranic energies up and down the chain of chakras that are said to be associated with the major nerve plexuses of the body. The fifth of Mr. Giri's subjects was a young man by the name of Mr. Tamananda. He demonstrated a remarkable yogic exercise called Nali, in which the muscles of the abdomen are individually and sequentially contracted and relaxed, resulting in a rotating or churning motion of abdominal muscles. Elda was especially impressed by the photogenic quality of the demonstration and obtained excellent footage that was later included in the film story. Before we left Chandigarh, Mr. Giri agreed to be a subject himself, and he also introduced a physicist who was interested in trying the brainwave feedback machine. I was highly impressed when the latter could easily produce beta, alpha, or theta at will. If alpha or theta was present, a high tone and or low tone was sounded, but he could turn on either of the two tones or turn them both off at will. When both tones were off, they were inferred that beta was present, a separate tone that had not been included to indicate the presence of beta. I asked how he developed such unusual control. I had not yet met anyone who in 2 minutes could produce abundance of theta waves at will, or turn it off at will. He said that he had meditated most of his life and that the state that he had demonstrated was of special importance to him. It was a reverie that he could quickly put himself into. In fact, he said that particular state was one that he had used to solve his doctoral research problem in physics. He said that he put himself into this state and the imagery showed him two significant contributions he could make to the field in which he was working. He quickly checked the ideas, then developed them into his research and doctoral dissertation. He said that throughout his professional life, whenever he was stuck on a problem, he would put himself in this state and examine the images. He described almost word for word the procedure that I, too, had developed for solving problems. I first used this method in 1946 when I was a graduate student in physics at UCLA, and later used it at University of Chicago to develop the single mathematical equation that accounts for both the logarithmic law and the power of law for visual sensation. They are a special case of general law described mathematically. Awareness of the possible usefulness of theta training for achieving such a state had led us to study psychophysiological training for creativity. And it was impressive to find someone on the other side of the world who was also aware of the importance of the reverie state for problem solving. Our next subjects were in the holy city of Varanasi, Benares, a long distance from Chandigarh. Arrangements were made for us at Benares Hindu University by Dr. Udepa, professor of surgery and director of the Institute of Medical Science, at whose request we lectured to physicians and medical students. One of Dr. Udepa's associates, Dr. Dubey, accompanied us during much of our visit and guided us to Sarnath, where the Buddha is said to have given his first sermon after he attained enlightenment. Dubey also introduced to us two people at the university who became research subjects. The first was Ramesh, who demonstrated a variety of hatha yoga postures and asanas. Ramesh is a teacher of yoga at the university, and although he was interested in meditative yoga, his training in hatha yoga focused mainly on exercise and self-control of physiological processes for purposes of enhancing health rather than demonstrating control of autonomic processes. The name Ramesh was given by his teacher. At the university, he was known as R.Y. Madhaseti War, Bachelor of Science, Diploma in Yogic Education, Institute of Medical Sciences. The second was Dr. H.C. Shukla, Head of Department of Basic Principles, Systems Theory, Institute of Medical Sciences. Dr. Shukla, we soon discovered, was thoroughly acquainted with the ancient traditions of India, and in addition had had the unusual opportunity to experience of being a student of Sudhir Babu, the remarkable astrologer written about by Paul Brunton in his book, A Search for Secret India, 1972. In Dr. Shukla's discussion of his years of learning with Sudhir Babu, he pointed out that the old astrologer had actually transcended astrology in the sense that the mental and emotional cycles of biorhythms associated with horoscopes were something to be overcome rather than to be a victim of. Sudhir Babu offered a science of alignment with nature through the cycles and events normally associated with one psychogenic structure, so to speak, could be handled from a meta dimension and eventually be replaced by cycles and events of transcendental order. In modern times, he was speaking of a subtle form of field independence, which we will say more about in the chapter on the field of mind theory. In advance, it can probably be said those who say there are no such finding as cycles unconsciously allow themselves to be overly influenced by cycles, ignoring them, and those who cannot make a decision without consulting their horoscope cycles suffer from the same problem. Only from the other side, they are overly influenced through giving them too much significance. Both extremes caught the rhythms of nature are generally ignorant of the law of volition, to borrow one of Alice Ann Bailey's concepts. The main problem, according to Shukla's teacher, is discover this law of volition and at the same time learn how to work in harmony with the Divine Mother, nature. Some of the experiences that Dr. Shukla said he had with his teacher were somewhat parallel by those of Doug Boyd, reported in his book Rolling Thunder. It rained when Rolling Thunder performed the appropriate ceremony, and also by the experience that Hans de Musteffen reported in his book 1953 book Wanderlust, an African witch doctor made it rain in an exactly delineated area. From his teacher, Shukla had learned of the electrical structure of the body, the chakra system, and its regulation through pranayama, breathing exercises. After we had become better acquainted, Dr. Shukla said that in the interest of science, he would like to attempt to demonstrate for us the focus of attention in different chakras while wired up. We were pleased to accept this offer, but warned him that the brainwave recording would probably show only continuous beta, implying continuous focus of attention. We had already noticed with a number of people who could visualize intensely that they often produced continuous beta, the indication of an active visual cortex. I have already mentioned that I automatically begin to see visual images if I shut my eyes for a long time and unless I refrain from examining the images and thus let myself sink into a reverie state. I have trouble producing alpha. People generally, however, find it easy to produce alpha and difficult to stay in beta for long periods of time with their eyes shut. Dr. Shukla understood this, but said that even if nothing except beta were found, that would be useful information. If he were to produce continuous beta in the occipital cortex, we could interpret that to mean continuous active focus of attention. As previously mentioned, we have not had an opportunity to analyze all the magnetic tape records from India with our PDP-12 computer, but we have had Dr. Shukla's record onto polygraph paper and have observed that a low amplitude alpha pattern, 15 to 30 microvolts, was present through much of his meditative states. The truly striking feature of record, however, was the appearance on occasion of bursts of alpha, lasting from 2 to 20 seconds, in which amplitude increased to 2.5 times normal. We knew from previous observation from conversation with Barbara Brown that altered states of consciousness are often associated with sudden doubling or tripling of alpha amplitude, so this was especially interesting finding. Before going to India, Elmer had contacted Dr. R.N. Kasil in Calcutta. His specialty is chest surgery, and one of his avocations is to be the superintendent of the Boy Scouts of West Bengal. He is also founder and director of the Institute of Sports Medicine in Calcutta, an activity that includes considerable yoga training. Because of this connection with yogis, we thought that perhaps a week would be spent in Calcutta with the psychophysiology lab, but it turned out that communication from Kansas to Calcutta was easier than any place to India to Calcutta. We were unable to get letters, telegrams, or telephone calls to him. Until the day we arrived in Calcutta, he was uncertain whether we were planning to visit him in November or December. Since arranging demonstrations with yogis takes time, we did not even unpack the lab. Instead, we talked to Dr. Sill about Aurobindo, who was his teacher, and went to him to see Aurobindo's birthplace in Calcutta, which is now a beautiful ashram and museum. A letter had arrived for us in care of Dr. Sill from James DeVries of the Aurobindo ashram at Pondicherry. Jim also had been in touch with us before the trip. He had suggested that a few people in the Pondicherry area might be good yoga subjects. His Calcutta letter suggested that it would be useful for us to stop at Puri, about 100 miles south of Calcutta on the Bay of Bengal, and visit the ashram of which Swami Harananda Giri was leader. Jim said that Harananda had demonstrated the electrical effect of energizing chakras to such an extent that it made the air glow. Perhaps he would be willing to demonstrate it for us. This was apparently the same phenomenon that Swami Rama had given me a photo of, taken in Chicago as mentioned before. If there is an electrical energy that can be mobilized by will in the body, it is not impossible to imagine that under certain intense conditions there might be a cold light emission. We returned to the U.S. January 24th, 1974. 3 months earlier, some of the group had suffered culture shock as we began our journey through the towns and villages of India. But I experienced shock mostly on our return to the US, either because of much reading or thinking I had already adapted to India before going there. What I had not anticipated or adapted to was the effect of returning home. Acres of airport concrete almost deserted at 11 p.m., elaborate buildings of metal and glass almost empty of people. The environment seemed unreal and sterile. As long as 3 months later, while sitting at my desk in the research building, the odd feeling would sometimes come of being in a place where life was partially unreal. I thought about it for weeks and finally realized that the essence of India to me was its realness. Both life and death are very present and very obvious. Almost every day as we drove along, we saw incapacitated people. Most of them were begging and some were dying. Some people were dying in public in the river cities of Benares and Hardwar. People had come to the holy Ganges to die, and some were dying in public in Calcutta and other places for simple reasons of having nowhere else to die. In India, death is different from anything we learn about from our Christian background. The attitude of the Indian people toward the forces of nature seemed much closer to that of rolling thunder than to our own. In 3 months, I had become so adapted to that feeling that it was a shock to return to the United States and become aware of what I had previously ignored. Namely, we do not talk about death. We do not think about death. We are unaware of death. We are afraid of death. It is buried in our unconscious, and we do not intend to bring it up and think about it. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's findings in 1969 from counseling 1,100 dying persons that fear and guilt plagued many dying Westerners suddenly seemed quite obvious. In India, death is a part of life, and life after death is part of a growing process. Neither eternal hell nor eternal harps, as is taught in much of our Christian system. As a Tibetan teacher put it at about 1880, life in the West became a struggle for life because of belief in hell, and religions, through their hells and damnation, inculcated the greatest dread of death. This is still a part of our heritage. Gradually, feeling of unreality faded away in me, but it took several months. Chapter 13, More Roots and Sources. The essence of science, it seems to me, is an attitude of disciplined curiosity. There is always the lure of unexplored and the challenge to develop methods that will make further exploration possible. Robert McLeod. Having discussed Swami Sufris and medicine men, we wish to mention some additional personal experiences that have shaped our thinking in our lives. And it's not that our experience have been so unique through some of them may seem strange to the newcomer to the field, but we offer them to show that an overall theory is necessary to encompass such experiences. The decision to include them was not made easily. Alice and I discussed the pros and cons again and again. In the end, we agreed that we want the reader to know where we are coming from, as our humanistic colleagues would put it. There is risk involved, of course. For about 40 years, we refrained from telling people about experiences that did not fit their frames of reference. According to Don Juan, The Journey of Ixtliton, Castaneda, 1972, the risk in telling is that if people know about you, they tell you down with their encumbering thoughts. But if you have had no personal history, no one pins you down with their thoughts.